Rome did not panic easily, but one message changed the mood inside its marble halls. The rumor moved through the streets faster than soldiers could control it. His name was Spartacus, and Rome was beginning to understand what it had created. From a ridge above the camp, he watched thousands gather around a dream Rome thought impossible. Roman soldiers had been trained to crush enemies, not run from escaped slaves. Inside rich villas, comfort suddenly felt fragile when smoke appeared on the horizon. The commanders looked at their maps and realized this was no ordinary escape. What began as a breakout was turning into a moving nation of the unwanted. For the first time, Roman landowners feared the people they had always controlled. Spartacus did not need a crown to become the most dangerous man in Italy. Rome had power, law, and armies. Spartacus had rage, memory, and nothing left to lose. Every new message made the Senate understand that humiliation was becoming a war. The soldiers marched forward, but even they could feel something different waiting ahead. A man Rome bought as property now stood before people who saw him as hope. The broken chains were not just metal, they were a warning to the entire republic. In the marketplace, fear spread because everyone understood what a slave revolt truly meant. Every captured shield proved that Rome's own strength could be turned against it. At night, the rebel camp breathed like a living thing, tired but growing stronger. Behind villa walls, wealthy families listened for footsteps that were not supposed to come. Before Rome feared him, before armies chased him, Spartacus was simply a man they owned. Long before the arena, he belonged to a harder world of hills, horses, and survival. In Thrace, freedom was not a word in a speech, it was the air he breathed. The young warrior had no idea that Rome would turn his life into a weapon. He came from a world of families, fields, and fighters who lived close to danger. Then Rome arrived at the frontier, disciplined, hungry, and convinced everything could be taken. For men like Spartacus, the Republic was not an idea, it was an advancing line of shields. Roman discipline broke through local resistance, and Spartacus watched his world collapse into dust. Captured but not broken, he carried defiance even when Roman hands held him down. The march into captivity was meant to erase his past and teach him obedience, but every step in chains was also a step toward Rome's greatest mistake. At the slave market, men were measured like animals and priced like tools. Buyers did not see a person standing there. They saw muscle, danger, and profit. Spartacus was chosen for the arena because Rome believed violence could be controlled. The road to Capua was not a road to training, it was a road to humiliation. The gladiator school rose like a prison built to turn suffering into entertainment. Inside the barracks, every man understood the same truth. Rome owned their tomorrow. Spartacus watched quietly, learning not only how men fought, but how fear ruled them. The training yard was brutal, because Rome needed slaves who could kill beautifully. Every strike taught Spartacus Roman methods, and every insult taught him Roman weakness. The trainers believed pain created obedience, but sometimes pain creates something far more dangerous. They were fed just enough to survive, because dead men could not entertain crowds. Inside those walls, different languages and homelands disappeared under the same chain. At night, the barracks became a room full of men waiting for death. While others slept, Spartacus stayed awake, refusing to let Rome decide the ending. The wealthy watched gladiators like spectacle, never imagining the spectacle was watching them back. Rome laughed from comfortable seats, while rage slowly sharpened itself in the sand below. Wounded fighters were carried away like broken tools, useful only until they failed. Spartacus saw what Rome did to men, and something inside him stopped bending. The helmet, the sand, the chains, all of it was a machine built from cruelty. By the time Rome noticed his strength, it had already taught him too much. In dark corners, men who were supposed to die began speaking about living. They studied guards, doors, routines, and every small mistake power makes when it feels safe. The plan was not heroic at first. It was desperate, dangerous, and almost impossible. Rome had locked them in with weapons everywhere, because arrogance rarely checks the kitchen. Spartacus watched the guards like a hunter, studying the rhythm of a careless animal. Every hour made the plan more dangerous, because one frightened man could betray them all. Suspicion moved through the school, and the choice became simple: move now or die waiting. Spartacus did not need a grand speech. His eyes told them freedom was worth the risk. The night before the escape, no one truly slept, because tomorrow demanded courage from broken men. In that darkness, a slave stopped being a prisoner and became the beginning of a revolt. When the moment came, it came fast, with feet pounding stone and fear turning into action. Kitchen tools became weapons, and ordinary objects became the keys to impossible freedom. The training yard that once broke them became the path they used to run. When the gate opened, the world outside felt dangerous, but it was theirs again. They ran into the night with chains still hanging from them, but Rome no longer held their souls. Capua woke to humiliation because the men it trained to kill had escaped alive. Out in the countryside, panic had to become order before freedom destroyed itself. They needed weapons, food, and time, so survival quickly became their first campaign. When real swords reached their hands, the escape became something Rome could no longer dismiss. At dawn, Spartacus looked at the survivors and saw the first army Rome never meant to create. They moved toward Mount Vesuvius because high ground gave desperate men a chance. Every step up the mountain carried them farther from slavery and closer to war. On the slopes, the fugitives built a camp that Rome believed was already trapped. Below them, Roman soldiers gathered with confidence, thinking hunger would finish the job. The Roman commander saw a cornered mob, not a leader studying the mountain. Spartacus looked at cliffs and vines and saw what arrogance had missed. The rebels twisted wild vines into ropes, turning nature into a secret weapon. In darkness, they prepared to climb down the impossible side of the mountain. One by one, men who had survived the arena trusted vines over Roman mercy. By dawn, Spartacus had moved behind the army sent to trap him. The Roman camp woke to disaster because the prey had become the ambush. Soldiers who expected surrender found themselves running from men they had underestimated. After Vesuvius, Spartacus was no longer a runaway, he was a proven commander. News of the victory reached people who had forgotten freedom could still be imagined. Workers, shepherds, and escaped slaves came to him because hope had finally found a direction. Spartacus understood the danger immediately. An escape was becoming a responsibility. Roman officials could explain one escape, but they could not explain this humiliation. Every abandoned shield reminded Rome that contempt had made it careless. The new followers needed more than courage. They needed discipline before Rome returned. On Vesuvius, the slave revolt became something larger than revenge or survival. The army came down from the mountain carrying stolen weapons and impossible confidence. Scouts moved ahead because Spartacus knew freedom dies quickly without information. On estates, enslaved workers watched the passing rebels like they were watching a doorway open. Some did not wait for permission. They ran from the fields toward danger and possibility. Every new arrival made the rebellion stronger, but also harder to feed and protect. The camp became a moving world of fighters, families, hunger, fear, and hope. Spartacus now had to think like a general and a guardian at once. Gladiators taught farmers to hold shields, because courage alone would not stop Rome. Behind every fighter stood people repairing clothes, carrying water, and keeping the army alive. At dawn, Spartacus saw thousands depending on him, and victory became heavier than chains. Provincial officials realized the revolt was spreading faster than their reports could calm it. Rome sent another force, still convinced discipline would easily break former slaves. But Spartacus had scouts now, and the countryside had become his eyes. He studied hills and roads, turning Italian terrain into a weapon against formation. The Roman column marched forward, believing order would save it from surprise. Then the ambush erupted, and the road became another lesson in Roman arrogance. Spartacus did not fight like a desperate fugitive. He fought like a commander. Again, Roman soldiers retreated from men they had been taught to despise. Every victory armed the rebels with better weapons and deeper belief. Spartacus knew celebration was dangerous, because each Roman defeat invited a larger response. In the Senate, embarrassment turned into anger, and anger slowly turned in landowners who lived from slave labor, now begged the Republic to protect them from slaves. The rebel army moved through Italy like a wound Rome could not close. Spartacus carried exhaustion in his face, but people still looked to him for tomorrow. Inside the camp, freedom meant different things to different people, and that became dangerous. Spartacus saw the north as escape, a road away from Rome's endless revenge. Some followers wanted that road, while others wanted the wealth Rome had denied them. The enemy was outside the camp, but division was beginning inside it. Roman eyes watched from the distance, learning that rebels could be studied and split. Spartacus faced the hardest question of leadership: save the people or satisfy their rage. The army moved north, and for a moment freedom looked almost reachable. The mountains ahead promised escape, but mountains also test the unity of armies. Spartacus had to move thousands through danger while keeping hunger and anger under control. Families marched with hope, believing the northern road might finally end their nightmare. Roman commanders understood the disaster. If Spartacus escaped Italy, Rome would look powerless. Troops rushed to block the routes because humiliation had become a national emergency. The road north became a wall of shields, and Spartacus had to break through. The rebels struck with the strength of people who could almost see freedom. Roman lines gave way again, but each victory carried the rebellion closer to a choice. The mountains waited ahead, yet the army behind Spartacus no longer wanted one future. Around the fires, arguments grew louder than the dream that once united them. One faction wanted revenge because leaving Italy felt too much like walking away. Spartacus stood among angry leaders, trying to hold together men shaped by pain. Families looked toward escape, while fighters looked back toward the estates that broke them. Then part of the rebellion separated, proving success can divide people as easily as failure. Spartacus watched them leave, knowing Rome would punish division faster than weakness. Roman commanders heard the news and finally saw a crack in the revolt. They prepared to strike the separated rebels before Spartacus could protect them. The breakaway force met Roman discipline without the full strength of the rebellion. Afterward, the broken camp showed the price of turning one army into two. When the message reached Spartacus, victory suddenly felt colder than defeat. He carried the loss in silence because leaders must grieve without collapsing. Around the fires, the rebels mourned men who had escaped chains only to die divided. Spartacus had to turn grief into discipline before Rome turned it into surrender. The training became harder because every survivor understood what disorganization could cost. Rome celebrated the smaller victory, but the larger fear still had a name. Spartacus moved again, now cautious enough to know hope could make armies careless. Roman patrols watched from a distance, no longer laughing at the slave commander. Around the fire, Spartacus planned not just revenge, but survival for everyone left. The rebellion had been wounded, but it had not yet learned how to kneel. The march south carried grief with it, but also a harder kind of discipline. Roman commanders tracked him, frustrated that the escaped gladiator still controlled the rhythm. Rebel scouts rode ahead because one wrong road could destroy thousands of lives. Spartacus now planned every movement like a man protecting a city without walls. This was not just an army anymore. It was families walking through enemy land. The villas of Italy watched the horizon, terrified by people they once ignored. When the rebels struck supply depots, they were not chasing glory. They were feeding survival. Food, clothing, and weapons moved through the camp like life, returning to exhausted bodies. Spartacus saw relief on their faces, but also knew hunger would return. In Rome, outrage grew because the Republic hated being embarrassed by the enslaved. Another legion prepared to march, believing enough discipline could finally end the nightmare. But Spartacus's scouts saw them first, and information became his invisible shield. He chose rough ground carefully, making the land fight beside the rebels. The Roman soldiers entered the narrow route, believing formation would protect them. Then the hills erupted, and Roman confidence broke under rebel coordination. Spartacus moved through battle with control, turning desperate people into a fighting machine. Once again, Roman order bent where Roman pride had refused to listen. After the victory, the rebels collected weapons with hands too tired to celebrate. Spartacus studied the captured equipment and understood the next Roman answer would be worse. For Roman commanders, defeat by slaves was not only military failure, it was shame. Across farms and mines, the news moved like fire through dry grass. Men who had known only labor began running toward the name Rome feared. The camp grew again, and growth brought strength, hunger, confusion, and danger. Leaders tried to organize the impossible, a moving army made from broken lives. At sunset, Spartacus stood before thousands who needed him to become more than brave. Wealthy Romans fled their villas, proving fear had finally crossed the class line. The Republic ordered stronger measures because panic was becoming a political problem. The rebel army crossed southern Italy like a people searching for a future. Spartacus looked tired because victory had given him more lives to protect. Rome finally understood the truth. This was not a breakout, it was a war. In the valley, the rebel camp stretched so wide, it looked like a new society. Keeping order became its own battle, fought with patience instead of as swords. Every desperate request reminded Spartacus that leadership was not glory, it was responsibility. Weapons were repaired beside cooking fires because survival and war now lived together. Roman scouts stared at the camp and realized contempt had blinded the Republic. Their reports reached commanders who could no longer pretend the rebellion was small. Spartacus moved through narrow roads, protecting the weak where Rome expected only fighters. Roman troops followed more carefully now, studying him instead of mocking him. He chose another battlefield with the patience of a man who understood terrain. The Romans advanced into ground selected by the enemy they still wanted to despise. The rebels struck from above, turning height and timing into force. Spartacus directed the fight, while old gladiators held the line for new soldiers. Roman formation cracked again, and every crack widened the legend around him. The rebels survived another clash, but survival was becoming more expensive every time. Spartacus did not smile at victory because he could feel Rome changing behind it. The Senate's anger became fear, and fear demanded a harsher kind of answer. The wealthy wanted protection because the rebellion threatened the world that protected them. Around rebel fires, freedom tasted real for a moment, but danger never left. Alone in the dark, Spartacus saw thousands of fires and thousands of responsibilities. He had become the man Rome could not ignore, without admitting weakness. So Rome sent stronger forces, marching with urgency where arrogance once walked. Scouts brought the warning, and the camp felt the future closing in. The leaders argued because every possible choice now carried a terrible cost. Spartacus stood between revenge and escape, between fighters' anger and families' fear. The civilians behind the army made every military decision painfully human. Weapons were sharpened in silence, because everyone understood another storm was coming. Roman commanders planned encirclement, hoping to trap what they could not easily defeat. Spartacus moved fast through the hills, refusing to let Rome choose the battlefield. When Roman soldiers reached the abandoned camp, only cold ashes answered them. From the ridge, Spartacus watched them search the wrong valley and kept moving. Before dawn, the rebels slipped away again, proving movement was still their greatest weapon. Roman commanders hated the pattern. Every trap closed after Spartacus had already vanished. When rebels struck the supply guard, they attacked, the one thing Rome could not fight without. Every captured sack of food meant another day the rebellion could keep breathing. Spartacus watched supplies spread through the camp, knowing strategy now meant keeping people alive. In Rome, frustration became desperation, because the Republic was losing control of its own story. The rich feared more than defeat. They feared the idea spreading beneath their floors. Inside the rebel camp, freedom had become many different dreams, pulling in different directions. Leaders argued by firelight, because every road forward now threatened to destroy someone. Spartacus looked north again, but the army behind him was becoming harder to guide. The march continued across open country, a rebellion stretched thin between hope and exhaustion. Roman scouts watched from ridges, learning the shape and rhythm of Spartacus's movement. Spartacus chose difficult roads because easy roads belonged to Rome. Rain and mud punished everyone equally, turning the dream of freedom into a daily struggle. He kept the columns moving because stopping too long could become another kind of prison. Roman soldiers marched with sharper discipline now, hardened by shame and fear. Their commanders understood the order clearly. Restore Roman honor, whatever the cost. When scouts returned with warnings, the camp changed from tired movement to urgent preparation. Spartacus planned under pressure, while civilians watched the fighters who protected their last chance. The rebels built a defensive line because sometimes survival means choosing where danger meets you. The Roman army advanced carefully now, no longer treating the rebels like a careless mob. Both sides faced each other, knowing this fight would decide more than ground. Spartacus stood before his fighters, with the weight of thousands behind every breath. The clash began in dust and shields, where fear had no room to hide. He held the line through pressure, because if the line broke, everything behind it broke. Roman soldiers pushed hard, but desperate people can become stronger than expected. The rebel counterattack came from exhaustion, courage, and the refusal to return to chains. When Rome retreated again, victory arrived without comfort or safety. The rebels survived, but every survival left fewer bodies and heavier silence. Spartacus was winning battles, yet Rome was learning how to win the war. The Senate finally understood ordinary commanders were not enough for this crisis. The elites demanded a man harsh enough to protect a world built on control. Then came Crassus, wealthy, severe, and determined to make fear obey him. He took command not with hope, but with punishment, discipline, and cold calculation. Under Crassus, Roman soldiers became less embarrassed and far more dangerous. He made failure terrifying because he knew frightened soldiers could still be useful. When Spartacus heard who was coming, the rebellion felt the weather change. The maps looked different now because Rome had finally sent patience against him. Crassus marched like a closing gate, slow enough to be certain. Spartacus kept moving, protecting families while trying to stay ahead of Roman discipline. Roman scouts followed more carefully, turning information into pressure on every rebel road. At night, Spartacus saw distant Roman fires and knew arrogance had been replaced by strategy. Crassus punished failure inside his own ranks, making Rome fear Rome before fearing Spartacus. The soldiers became harder after that, not braver, but more obedient. Inside the rebel camp, every leader knew the old rhythm of victory was ending. Spartacus chose withdrawal because direct pride could kill the people he still had to save. Crassus followed without rushing, tightening the world around the rebels step by step. Then the coast appeared, and for one moment, the sea looked like mercy. Spartacus stared at the water as if freedom might arrive on ships. The camp near the shore filled with fragile hope and dangerous waiting. Pirate envoys came like opportunity, but opportunity often arrives wearing another man's greed. Spartacus bargained because the sea was the only door Rome did not fully control. Families packed their bundles believing the nightmare might finally cross the water and end. At dusk, Spartacus waited on the shore, while the future stayed beyond reach. Then the ships failed them, and the horizon became empty betrayal. Spartacus faced the sea with anger he could not afford to waste. The camp shook with panic because hope had collapsed faster than any battlefield line. From the land, Crassus advanced, disciplined, patient, and certain the trap was closing. Spartacus saw the truth clearly. The sea behind him, Rome before him. At the edge of disaster, the rebellion stood between escape, denied, and destruction approaching. His closest leaders looked to him, but even courage could not summon ships from empty water. Crassus changed the land itself, ordering walls and trenches to become Rome's answer. Soldiers dug until southern Italy began to look like a giant cage. When rebel scouts found the fortifications, they understood the enemy was no longer chasing. Spartacus looked across the trench line and saw Rome trying to bury freedom alive. Food ran low, fires burned smaller, and hunger began fighting inside the camp. He prepared a breakout because waiting would let starvation win without a battle. At night, rebels tested the Roman line, searching for weakness in the dark. The first attempt failed, and the mud carried back more fear than hope. Crassus watched from the wall, believing patience had finally defeated the slave commander. Inside the camp, hunger made every face older and every decision more dangerous. Spartacus walked among them, seeing the cost of every delay in their eyes. Around the fire, every plan sounded impossible, but doing nothing sounded worse. So he made the choice leaders fear most: risk everything before everything disappears. That night, the rebels prepared quietly, because even hope had to move without noise. Rain covered their footsteps as they approached the Roman line in darkness. Then Spartacus led them forward, not toward victory, but toward one last opening. Through mud, stakes, and shields, the rebels forced a hole in Rome's cage. Some escaped into the darkness, but freedom now came broken into scattered pieces. At dawn, Crassus saw the breach and understood Spartacus was still dangerous. The survivors regrouped, exhausted and fewer, counting faces that would never return. The rebellion had escaped the trap, but not as one body anymore. Roman cavalry hunted the scattered groups, turning confusion into a weapon. Spartacus now led a smaller force, and every horizon carried Roman dust. Crassus tightened the pursuit again, refusing to let the wounded rebellion breathe. Wagons were abandoned, supplies were dropped, and survival became a race through hills. Separated rebels fell to Rome because courage alone could not replace unity. Each message of loss made the camp quieter until silence became unbearable. By a dying fire, Spartacus faced the truth without surrendering to it. He had escaped the cage, but Rome had stolen the rebellion's momentum. The final march began without glory, only tired feet and stubborn hearts. Behind them, Crassus advanced like a machine built from discipline and revenge. Scouts returned with the same warning from every road. Rome was closing. The final council had no easy answer, only fear wearing different faces. Families held their bundles tighter, understanding that dawn might bring the end. Spartacus passed through the camp, and every look asked him for a miracle. Firelight showed a man worn by war, but not yet defeated by it. Across the field, Rome prepared carefully, determined not to be embarrassed again. Shields aligned, spears lifted, and Roman discipline turned silence into threat. Spartacus formed his remaining fighters, placing courage where numbers had disappeared. The rebels burned what they could not carry, leaving retreat behind them. At dawn, the army that remained still stood because freedom had not surrendered. Then the Roman lines appeared, vast, disciplined, and impossible to ignore. Between the two armies, the dust held a silence heavier than shouting. Spartacus looked across the field at the order that had enslaved him. His fighters were frightened, but fear did not make them Roman property again. The Roman signal sounded, and history stepped forward behind locked shields. The rebels charged because there are moments when survival becomes defiance. The armies collided, and the dream of freedom met the weight of empire. Spartacus fought at the front, where leaders become symbols or disappear. Roman discipline pressed forward, slow, patient, and deadly under the dust. Spartacus tried to cut toward command, chasing the heart of the machine. But the rebel lines began to split, and courage scattered under pressure. Still he fought, refusing to let Rome see him fall in spirit. Cavalry closed the sides, infantry closed the front, and the circle tightened. Around Spartacus, the last fighters held because surrender meant returning to nothing. Then dust swallowed him, and history lost the exact place where he fell. When the field went quiet, Rome had won the battle, but not the memory. The survivors were taken, and the price of rebellion became brutally clear. Rome raised its standards, but broken chains still lay in the dust. Victory felt heavy because even Rome knew this war had exposed something dangerous. The captured rebels marched away, but their footsteps carried a story Rome could not erase. Commanders reported success, yet relief sounded different after fear had entered the Senate. The villas reopened, but the people inside them would never feel untouchable again. The abandoned camp became a silent record of hunger, hope, and loss. A helmet beside broken chains said what no Roman speech could hide. The road became a warning, built to frighten anyone who remembered freedom. But among the enslaved, his name survived in whispers Rome could not arrest. Markets returned to noise, yet beneath the noise lived a new unease. Rome kept its columns and standards, but resistance had shown its face. Spartacus became more than a man because Rome never found a way to own his memory. Around quiet fires, people remembered the slave who made the powerful afraid. Senators could pretend the crisis had ended, but fear had already changed them. The empty training yard remained, proof that cruelty can create its own enemy. From Thrace to chains, from arena to army, his life became a warning. Spartacus did not build an empire, but he shook one from beneath. For those still trapped, sunrise meant the dream had not completely died. Rome continued marching, ruling, and building, but it never forgot the slave war. Broken chains in the dust became the simplest monument to impossible resistance. And that is why Spartacus still matters. He lost the war, but made Rome afraid of the people it tried to erase.